Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, make sure you check out the Poketown store, especially over the festive period, as you can apply for some free goodies over on that website. For today's video, we're going to be looking at the expected Sword and Shield rule changes that are going to be coming into effect on February 2020. This is all sparked, of course, from the recent rule changes that we have seen over in Japan. I've taken a quick screenshot of the PokéBeach website where I first saw this article a few months ago now, but it's only recently been implemented. November 29th was when the Japanese standard format rotated. They have now gone to an Ultra Prism all the way up to Sword and Shield format, and alongside the release of these two new Japanese sets, the players going first can no longer play supporters on that first turn. So it really is a big change to what we know and have known for a number of years now, and today I'm going to be discussing how this will have an impact on the game itself and overall just my thoughts on this rule change. First of all though, we're going to be rolling back the years and discussing how restrictions have changed in the Pokemon trading card game since its inception way back when. So we're going to be looking at these. Some of them can give us a bit of an indication on how things will be in the Sword and Shield meta, and, you know, whether or not we want to go first even anymore. So let's get into this, starting off with base set all the way up to Skyridge, so the Wizards of the Coast era. I think also for the initial release of Ruby Sapphire, pre-Worlds, there were no restrictions. So even with some Ruby Sapphire formats, there were no restrictions on turn 1. As long as it's before the first World Championships, you can do anything you want. You get to draw for turn going first, you can play everything, you know, there's still the regular restrictions of attaching energy a turn, etc, etc, but you can do anything with your cards. There's nothing you're specifically not allowed to play turn 1, and you're allowed to attack as well, which is pretty important. So that's what I mean by no restrictions. You can expect to draw, you can expect to play everything, and you can also expect to attack. And then it's in these other areas where things do sometimes get restricted going forward. So from the World Championships all the way through the EX era, pre-Diamond and Pearl, so from 2004 up to 2006, players were no longer able to play supporter cards. Sound familiar, right? And also they do not get to draw for turn. So this is pretty much the formats where we can really sort of take inspiration from. I think one thing to note about this sort of era was that obviously the player can attack still. That's why we saw a lot of different archetypes and decks that were successful in this era use sort of turn 1 style attackers. Things like Dunsparce and whatnot. These are all really, really strong cards, because then there's a big advantage still in going first. Even if you weren't able to use supporters, you could still get a setup going thanks to using some of those attacks, which is pretty important. So I think that's definitely something to note. This is a sort of era where we can take inspiration from, but attacking was allowed, and most importantly, sort of setup attacks were certainly a thing that was implemented in a lot of people's decks to really make up for the fact that you couldn't really draw many cards on the opening turn, but you could still tutor out, most importantly, your Pokemon. So that's why you see old sort of decks playing things like 4 copies of the old Dunsparce that had Strike and Run, and a few other setup style Pokemon as well. So definitely something to note. As Diamond and Pearl rolled around in 06, all the way through to Call of Legends, pre-Black and White, the rules were changed again. The player is now no longer able to play trainers, supporters, or stadium cards. So you're basically just able to attach and attack, even more restricted than in the 2004 to 2006 era. So you weren't really able to do much. The only means of really drawing cards was from abilities and such, but it was pretty much just attach, attack, and send it your opponent's way. In the Black and White era, all the way up until Legendary Treasures, there were no restrictions at all. So once again, we basically go all the way back to square one, where you're able to play supporters, play trainers, play everything you want, and also attack your opponent. So this was the most obvious era in the TCG where going first was premium. Obviously, right now, we're still in that era where going first is pretty premium. No one chooses to go second unless it's very rare situations. And in the post-black and white era, basically the entire black and white block, you would always choose to go first. There's no reason not to. You can play the game. You're literally a turn ahead of your opponent the entire time, and your opponent's trying to play catch-up against you. In 2013, with the release of XY, all the way up until Cosmic Eclipse, there was a slight change where you are no longer able to attack on turn 1. So you're able to gain a good amount of hand advantage by using supporters, and even in recent times, with Welder, you're able to get significant energy attachment advantage on the opponents, but you're not able to start swinging into them straight away. I think that's obviously a big deal. The amount of hit points we have on some of our non-GX Pokemon compared to some of the attacks we can do on some of our tag teams, pretty obvious that you don't want to be able to have that sort of attack presence available to you for the player going first. It's just too ridiculous, really. So, pretty obvious change there, but obviously a good one. Now we move into the 2020 era. Well, we haven't moved in there yet, but that's what we're looking towards now, where the player cannot attack or play supporter cards. And I think this is pretty much on par with 2004, 2006 era, as I said earlier, in terms of stringency. I think 06 to 010 is where it was almost detrimental to go first, but I think in 04, 06 it was still good to go first the majority of the time, and you just sort of changed your deck in a certain way to benefit going first. And I certainly think that's going to be how we look at decks going into 2020 era. You probably still want to go first in a lot of situations, and the fact that you can't attack or play supporters should be balancing the scales of the person going first compared to the person going second. So I do like that it's a bit more stringent than it has been previously. I think in the last 6-7 years or so since the release of XY, man, that makes me feel old. It's been pretty obvious. Whenever you win the coin flip, you say, I go first. And going into this new format, there may be some more consideration towards who wants to go first, which I think is pretty cool. So here are my initial reactions. Just again, I've sort of already started to talk about this, but just getting it down on paper. Making that coin flip less impactful at pretty much deciding the outcome of a game is obviously a good thing. We're not sitting down to play rock, paper, scissors against the opponent. We're not just trying to flip the coin and see, straight away as soon as you flip tails, you know that you can't win the game. No one wants to do that. We want the game to be skill-based. We have enough RNG element just by shuffling up our cards and all that good stuff. So there's plenty of RNG involved without having to worry about the coin flip before you even start setting up to begin your game. So making that as unimpactful as possible means that skill becomes more impactful in the outcome of the game, which can only be a good thing, which is perfect. Also, I've already said that this is one of the most severe restrictions we've ever had for turn 1, and it pretty much does bring a genuine decision for us when we are going into tournaments now. It may be a decision based on entirely what sort of deck you're playing, whether you want to say, if I win a coin flip going into this tournament, I will always choose to go first, or I will always choose to go second. That could genuinely be a thing on a deck-to-deck basis, or on like a sort of basis based on what your opponent's playing. Maybe you've seen yourself lose game 1, and then you experience what they have in their deck and think that you have a better chance of beating them if you're able to go second against them or first against them, So having that extra decision is going to be really important, and again, just rewards better play and smarter decision making, rather than just going, okay, I lost game 1, I start, obviously, because it gets me like 8 more cards than the opponent in the majority of situations, which is pretty insane, really. Also, as I've iterated to earlier, deck building can go pretty differently, I think. We haven't really built decks that want to go first or want to go second for a long time. We've basically just built our decks exactly the same no matter what, and if you are the person who loses the coin flip, you're just unlucky. But now we might tailor decks around, having a lot of item and ability-based draw and having a lower supporter count, and there could be plenty of decks that just want to have specific attackers for turn 1 that can either get a bunch of damage on the board early, setup damage, or have some sort of setup style attack alongside powerful turn 1 supporters. You know, you get to double up on the opponent who's just gone first, pretty much attached, and done a few other bits here and there, but hasn't really got a huge setup going. Now the person going second might have that small way back into the game by either getting better hand advantage early or can, you know, access attacks earlier. So I do think we may start seeing decks that are tailored to going second, which could be interesting. I also think that it gives Pokemon themselves, as designers, a lot less restrictions with creating new supporter cards. I think you can already see that with some of the new supporters we've had from the latest set. Bring back Juniper/Sycamore, and also bringing out Marnie, which is a much stronger version of Judge, because the person playing Judge, Marnie, sorry, is no longer a symmetrical effect. You're now getting hand advantage on the opponent just in raw numbers alone, which is pretty good. And I think, were it not for this turn 1 supporter rule change, they may have been way more hesitant to actually print a card like Marnie, because it could very well be a very dangerous card for those opening turns where a Shuffle 5 is, you know, a Shauna, basically. It wasn't that detrimental of an effect, Pokemon thought, when they printed that Shauna supporter. We've played things like Shauna and Birch's Observations previously, and now doing the same sort of effect for yourself, whilst also being very detrimental to the opponent turn 1, could have been very risky. So they now have scope to make cards like Marnie, knowing that the player who gets to use this card, at the very least, has given the opponent a chance to draw for turn and try and play, you know, something or a few things from their initial 8 cards. And it's not just those 8 cards, of course. We have enough abilities in the format right now with Stellar Wish, with Dead Change, we have Acrobikes, we have all sorts of item-based draw as well, and a handful of other abilities that can draw us cards, that at least the opponent has had the chance, if they want to put those cards in their deck, to have done a couple of things to get set up before they get hit with a Marnie and go straight back down to 4 cards. That's the biggest reason why Let Loose was such like a headache for a bunch of people. The person going first can just let loose the opponent before they've been able to play a single card, and they're at a huge disadvantage. Marnie could have created a similar bad feeling for opponents, just because you're starting the game with a 5-card hand rather than a 7 or 8-card hand. So, yeah, the fact that now the person has to be going second, it means player 1 has at least had a chance to play a few cards from their hand and thin their deck and maybe even search their deck, all that sort of stuff. So I do think it's a good change for supporters, but also it could mean that even more powerful supporters can be expected to come out from the Sword and Shield block, because they now have more creative rights to do these sorts of disruptive supporters, knowing that player 1 has at least had a chance to build a board to prepare around that sort of thing to begin with, which is cool. I do think the new rule changes will increase donks very slightly, just because naturally you can't draw as many cards if you can't play a supporter on the first turn. Yes, you can tailor your deck to playing a bunch of abilities and playing a bunch of items that draw you cards instead in the place of supporters. But ultimately, supporters are usually the most powerful means of drawing cards. So if you're unable to access those, you're just naturally going to have a less, rigid board as you pass over from turn 1 to your opponent, who gets to start attacking you straight away. So there is slightly a higher risk of donks than previously, but I do think right now the game is very safe with the amount of abilities that we have in the format, that it's not going to be a problem. I think I've already heard a bunch of people saying that the format's going to be slow. It's a really stupid thing to say. The format's not going to be slow. We have Dead Change in the format, so, I mean, you can quite easily see like 19 cards going first without using a draw supporter. That's the initial 8 that you have. You know, you're starting 7 plus draw for turn. Then you get to see 6 more cards with Dead Change, and then Stellar Wish lets you see 5 more cards. I'm saying that in air quotes, because you're only able to cherry pick, from those 5. You're not actually getting those 5 cards. And there's even more abilities on top of that, like the Zacian that we have from the set allows you to draw 3 to end your turn. I can certainly see that being an ability going into all sorts of decks, because it's a great ability to just sort of pass your turn on when you go first these days. So getting that +3 at the end as well is pretty insane. There's all sorts of ways that you can get through a good portion of your deck turn 1, so I don't think it's an issue. You know, there'll be plenty of decks wanting to go first still, and you're not going to be just looking at your starting hand and sighing and being like, fine, attach, go, start swinging into me. It feels like we have a lot of Pokemon in the game right now which can help us be consistent without the use of supporter cards. Obviously, Stellar Wish, you know, will have different targets these days. Usually, Stellar Wish will be looking for a supporter. Now it's going to be looking for, like, Ball Search for Dedenne, or POKÉMON, or all this other stuff to actually get your initial Pokemon down. So, deck building itself will change, but I do really think that we still have enough tools in the game right now, even, you know, we haven't even seen all the cards that will be in our February sets. There's still a couple more sets from Japan to be released where there may even be even more abilities or item cards that can help us out going first. So thinking that the game is going to be much slower is a really dangerous thing to think because decks are still going to be fast. I mean, Welder's still a card in the format. Your opponent can be churning out good damage against you going second very, very quickly. And the person going first has still had the chance to, you know, begin their own strategy as well. So rather than thinking that the game is like way worse now, I really just think of it that it can only be an improvement for the game, because you have to think of the player going first with restrictions as if they were the person just going second, but they were able to get an extra attachment down, you know? That's how I compare it to the current format, where there's basically been no restriction other than attacking. Now the person gets that small consolation of being able to draw first and probably getting energy down on board first, maybe getting a couple of basics down on board first. Those are the most important things to give yourself a bit of, you know, rigidness and a bit more survivability against people. Otherwise, in the current format, there's basically nothing that the person going second gets outside of being able to swing first. Now it's a lot better of a deal, I think, overall, and a lot more fair. So the question then becomes, should we go first or should we go second? What's going to give us the highest win percentage? And I think it will be on a deck-to-deck basis. I think it is such a well-balanced rule that you most often, I think, still choose to go first. But there will certainly be exceptions where you may choose to go second. I think if your deck is built around key supporter cards, like things... Obviously, I'm expecting a lot of decks to adapt and supporter counts and stuff to change, and decks, as we know them, will all be changing. Even the archetypes that we do know well, they will be changing a lot in terms of the composition of the actual 60 cards. But in general, I think if a deck is built around key supporters, like Welder, which will still be a good card, you probably want to choose to go second if you're given the option. I think if you have attackers that accelerate energy or get your Pokemon into play, you may choose to go second as well. So using things like Flare Starter, I think especially for the greens decks, because it sort of ties into the first and the second piece together, where you want to use a greens turn 1 if you can, or like the first turn you're able to. And you can also benefit from, you know, Guardian's Fairy Song or Flare Starter. Both of these are great to just kick off your game and get a bunch of energies into play. So I can certainly see greens decks, if they are going to survive, would choose to go second given the choice. And also if you're wanting to be a pure non-GX deck and have no GXs in play whatsoever in your deck whatsoever, you'll probably choose to go second. I think plenty of decks that will have an element of GX won't mind going first at all, because they can just Dede change and sort of have a pseudo Sycamore effect, basically. Now, if you're trying to be pure non-GX, you still have things like Stellar Wish available to you, but the majority of your draw will come in the form of, you know, stage 1 draw, like Zeb Striker or Pidgeotto or Cincino. So I think those decks will probably want to go second because they want to be able to use good supporters to help you get your Pokemon into play, which can be pretty important. You may still choose to go first if energy acceleration isn't really your forte, or at least in those opening turns. I think things like Pikarom and ADP, they really love going first because they get that extra attachment down. Turn 1 attached to Pikarom Pass is honestly like a super fine play for the deck, because you know that the following turn you can use a supporter and your draw power from Dedenne and such to try and dig towards Thunder Mountain, get an attachment, and suddenly you're full blitzing. Similar for ADP. Currently in the format right now, turn 1 attach pass to an ADP is absolutely fine, because you know you can guarantee altar creation turn 2 quite happily with the help of supporters from then on out. So I think you may still choose to go first with those sorts of archetypes, just because physically getting an energy down is still so beneficial to the deck that nothing else really matters. Also, if evolutions are integral for your setup, decks that really don't get going until your stage 1s are into play, I'm looking at the new Frostmoth kind of stuff with Lapras VMAX, and also Malamar archetypes. They may still choose to go first, just so they can get, 1 in-K down, 2 in-Ks down, whatever. Even if they can't use supporters, you're not really expecting to get, like 3 in-Ks down or something. But with better ball search that we have in the format right now, Quick Ball coming out, and POKÉMON already being like a 4-of that you can play, it's not unrealistic to think that your opening hand will still get you a means of getting a couple basics down, even without using things like Deadly Change and whatever. You can just go ahead, get those basics down, slap an energy somewhere, send it over to your opponent. That's pretty much how I'm expecting turn 1s to go these days, unless you're still going to be a turbo build. If you're going to be a turbo build, it's going to be, you still seeing like 14 or so cards by having your opening hand, then Deadly Changing, then getting your attachment going, all that sort of stuff, and end your turn on like a Zacian ability, pretty much. That's the sort of alternative. But if you're going to be more sort of non-GX Evolve based, you're basically just going to get a couple basics down and pass, and be happy with that, and happy that you got to go first, because your game kicks on from then on by being able to evolve. So that kind of leads me into changes to deck building. I know this has kind of been more of a sort of stream of consciousness. I have tried to put things into bullet points to structure my own discussion, but I've been jumping over and bouncing ideas around this entire time. But this is kind of the main takeaways, I think, of looking at the game when you cannot play supporters turn 1. If you still want to draw a bunch of cards, and if you're a combo deck, you probably want to have a bigger focus on ability and item-based draw. Acrobike being a 4-of may not be uncommon for most decks in the game going forward, to be honest. We have better recovery pieces now with the new fishing rod. So there's less downside to having a big discard with Acrobikes. We even have, we have better ball search for Dedenne and such. So I think digging through your deck will certainly be a thing. With these abilities, Stellar Wish is never going to be bad. It's still super insane. Even if it can't target supporters turn 1, it can target supporters for the remainder of the game, which is still the biggest portion of the game. And it can still access ball search in those opening turns. And like I said, that Zacian V, that ability just looks better and better, where you're able to look at the top 3 cards of your deck, attach any metals to the guy if you see any in the top, and then draw the remainder. So plenty of decks that don't even want to attack with the Zacian could quite easily just like take those top 3 cards and just end your turn by drawing 3. It's like using a How to end your turn. So it's almost making up for the fact that you couldn't use a supporter on that ability alone, which could be pretty insane. All you got to do is find a ball search card or physically find the Zacian. So that seems very, very good. Although I think Zacian V is best just as an attacking guy and like will be used in ADP and all these sorts of things as an attacking threat, you could quite easily start seeing him in decks as like a 1-of, just like how we saw Lele in all sorts of different decks, etc. Now, I'm not saying that Zacian's as good as Lele, but its ability is comparable in terms of how much it can help you turn 1, which is pretty cool. I do think turn 1 supporters, and tutors especially for them, may see much less play. I think POKÉGEAR pretty much just gets cut from almost every deck going forward into Sword and Shield meta. I think you would direct your slots towards ability draw or item draw in other means, rather than just having better outs to supporters, because most of the time with POKÉGEARs, you want them to help you get turn 1 supporters. You want to improve your greens odds, improve your elm odds, improve your Lily odds. Obviously, POKÉGEAR helps you in the mid-game and such as well, but the idea is once you find your first supporter, you're thinning the deck or drawing through the deck to find you more supporters. So POKÉGEAR is most important on those opening turns, and now it's not usable if you're going first, which is pretty awkward. So I think in general, as I said, there'll be a number of decks that want to go second, but there'll be another portion of decks that will just be reducing their turn 1 supporter count in favor of just like a number of Cynthias and a number of other supporters, but then looking more towards Pokemon search to use ability draw, basically. And that leads me to the bottom line, where if you are a deck that wants to put early damage on the board already, like naturally, just by the nature of your build, or if you want to have this big sort of setup rolling, you're going to need supporters for it at the end of the day. If you're going to sort of be Exodia with a Florgus Doll Loop, you probably want to use an Oak setup turn 1. If you want to be a fast ADP build with the new Bede or with Ends Resolve, you can certainly try and build your deck around going second. If you want to be good old turn 1 Welder, turn 2 Welder, hit for 300, you can still do that, you just have to choose to go second these days. So I think there still will be all sorts of decks that want to go second. I haven't really sat down and looked at decks individually just yet, because the full set's not out for Sword and Shield. We still have a couple of Japanese sets to come, even if they are just mini sets. There will be impactful cards. So I don't want to, stick my neck out and talk about what decks will always go first, what decks will always go second, how all these archetypes are going to be changing. I just wanted to give you a basic rundown of what I thought about the rule changes. Let me know what you guys think about the rule changes. Do you think it's good for the game? Do you think it's bad for the game? Do you think it helps certain decks way more than others? Do you think certain archetypes that we've seen up until now completely die off based on just the fact that they can't support a turn 1? I've seen a lot of people say that like Green's decks are just completely dead, because if ever a Green's deck whiffs Green on turn 1, they lose the game instantly, which is kind of fair. But I think you also have to take into perspective how, in air quotes, slow other people's turn 1s will be when everyone is restricted. Like, if it's a level playing field, it feels like going first isn't like that big of a deal anymore, which is such a good thing. And overall, I don't know, it just feels really good for me. I think it's a really positive change for the TCG, and I think with all the like power creep complaints, I think scaling down turn 1 and making it more of a 50-50 going first, it really will change the landscape of the game. I think it's going to be a really good thing. I'm finding it hard to describe why I think it's going to be a good thing, because it's such an abstract concept, but like, going first at the moment is such a huge advantage when damage is so high and one-hit KOs are such a factor in the format currently, that you get like this big incentive to just go ahead and start charging at the opponent, and then the only way the person going second can ever make a comeback is reset stamp and pray, basically. I know that's sort of making it a little bit like I'm simplifying the game a lot right now, but I think with the rule changes, it's way more balanced just from the offset. The person going first gets that small bit of setup going, but then the person going second can sort of trump their turn 1, and then it's when it comes to turn 3 from the original player, so the first player's second turn, they should be on a pretty even keel once they've used their first supporter and got themselves back into the game. So I think it starts a tug of war way more fairly in the game overall, which can only be a good thing. So yeah, hopefully I described things pretty well. Hopefully I gave you some food for thought with all this stuff. I hope you didn't enjoy the little discussion here, guys, of my initial reactions. Hope you enjoyed the run-through of the rules over time. It's one of those things, whenever I whip out old format decks, I always forget that these rule changes are a thing. So for me, at least, just having this all in one place is going to be helpful for when I'm doing Worlds format decks. So yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I'll be back tomorrow with more videos. Cheers.